All right, the move didn't come with a press conference. It didn't come with a leaked memo, a televised address, or the kind of orchestrated rollout that communications teams spend weeks architecting when they want maximum control over the first 24 hours of a story. It came on a Tuesday afternoon when Pam Bondi's office transmitted a single procedural directive that landed in the right inboxes at the wrong time for everyone who had spent 14 months convinced it would never happen. By the time the political world caught up to what the document actually said, the chain reaction had already begun. And chain reactions, once they start, don't pause for the people they're about to reach. What Bondi triggered wasn't just a policy move. It wasn't just an institutional realignment or an enforcement posture adjustment dressed up in bureaucratic language that the professional class would spend the next week debating in terms most people don't follow. What she triggered was a sequence, a documented, traceable, consequential sequence that is now running through the institutional architecture of the Justice Department in ways that the people who built their entire political positioning around the assumption that this sequence could never be started are now watching with a specific kind of horror. The kind that comes not from surprise, but from the sudden recognition that the thing you publicly dismissed as impossible has just been publicly proven otherwise. I've been tracking the internal response since the directive cleared the system. The reaction inside certain orbits of the Republican coalition has been operating on 3 tracks simultaneously, each one revealing a different dimension of how badly the move was miscalculated by the people who are most exposed by it. And the gap between what the public response has been claiming about why this is happening and what the documented record shows about what's actually happening is the gap that nobody covering the meltdown this week has been willing to cross all the way. Here's what the coverage is still not telling you about what just happened and why the chain reaction matters more than the headline that introduced it. The directive didn't originate in a vacuum. It originated in a pattern. A careful, deliberate, professionally constructed pattern of institutional positioning that Bondi has been building since the confirmation hearings ended, and the operational authority of the Attorney General's office transferred from performance to execution. The confirmation period was the public-facing phase. The rehearsed answers, the careful framings, the calibrated distances from the questions that carried the most institutional consequence. That phase served its purpose. It got her confirmed. It established a public record that could be cited in both directions toward the coalition that wanted reassurance and toward the institutional framework that needed to believe the office would function within recognizable professional norms. What followed the confirmation was different. What followed was the operational phase. And the operational phase doesn't run on the same logic as the confirmation phase. The confirmation phase is about managing audiences. The operational phase is about managing institutions. And the specific institution that Bondi is now managing in ways that have sent certain corners of the Trump alliance into the particular kind of meltdown that generates emergency phone calls on Tuesday evenings is an institution that has been carrying a set of unresolved questions about its own independence for years, questions that the directive she transmitted on Tuesday did not create, but has now forced into a form that the people affected by them can no longer manage through the techniques that were working when the questions stayed at the level of abstraction. They're not at the level of abstraction anymore. The specific operational content of what Bondi moved on involves prosecutorial resource allocation in a way that intersects directly with the investigation architecture that certain figures in the extended Trump orbit had understood based on communications and assurances and the general management of expectations that happens in the informal channels around any administration to be pointed in a specific direction. Not indefinitely, but long enough. Long enough for other proceedings to conclude, for other legal exposures to resolve. For the window in which the specific targeting that the directed resources represent could operate to close without producing the outcomes that the resource allocation, once fully activated, was always going to be capable of producing. The window didn't close. And the directive that opened it wider arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a form that couldn't be managed retroactively because it was already in the system by the time the people who needed to manage it knew it existed. To understand why certain figures in the Trump world are now operating in what one practitioner familiar with the relevant congressional relationships described to me as genuine panic mode, not performed alarm, not strategic concern cultivation, not the manufactured outrage that functions as a political tool in normal circumstances, but actual, unperformed. This is a real problem panic. The timeline that produced Tuesday's directive has to be traced from the specific sequence of decisions that made it both possible and, given the documented record, probably inevitable. The sequence began not with Bondi, but with the architecture she inherited. The Justice Department that Bondi took operational control of had been shaped, during the preceding period, by a set of institutional decisions that left certain investigative threads in a state of suspended animation technically open, professionally maintained, adequately resourced, but not moving in ways that generated the kind of documented forward progress that external observers could point to as evidence of active prosecutorial momentum. That suspended animation served purposes that different people in different positions understood differently. For some, it represented responsible resource management. For others, it represented political accommodation of the kind that careful institutional leaders exercise when the operational and political environments are in tension with each other. For the people now in Meltdown, it represented a durable arrangement, an understanding that the suspended state would persist as long as the broader political conditions that made it comfortable remained in place. Bondi inherited that architecture. And the first signal that she was going to do something different with it than what her predecessors had done wasn't Tuesday's directive. It was the series of personnel decisions and internal reorganization moves that preceded the directive by 60 days, in a way that, viewed in isolation, could be characterized as routine management of a large bureaucratic institution. Viewed in sequence, it looks considerably less routine. It looks like a methodical dismantling of the operational structure that had been sustaining the suspended animation, followed by the construction of a replacement structure oriented around different priorities and different allocations of investigative momentum. The people now in Meltdown were watching those moves. Some of them were communicating concern through the channels that exist between the political world and the institutional world, the informal networks of shared professional history and ongoing relationship management that supplement the formal lines of authority. The concern being communicated was, in the language of those channels, calibrated, not alarmed, not demanding. Calibrated in the way that sophisticated actors in the political institutional space signal preferences, without triggering the kind of formal confrontation that would generate a documentary record nobody wants to create. Bondi received those communications. The record suggests she understood them. And on Tuesday afternoon, she transmitted a directive that was the clearest possible institutional response to them, not a refusal in language that could be characterized as oppositional, but an operational move that accomplished exactly what the communicated concerns were asking her not to accomplish, in a form that was professionally defensible, institutionally grounded, and essentially impossible to reverse through the informal channels that had been generating the calibrated concern. The chain reaction started at that moment, not with Tuesday's directive. With the realization, arriving in stages across the affected orbits of the coalition, that the informal management strategy had failed, and the formal reality was now running on its own momentum. The meltdown that followed has been documented across enough public statements, social media responses, and political commentary that its contours are visible even to observers who don't have access to the private communications driving its emotional intensity. But what's visible publicly is the surface. The structure beneath the surface, what's actually driving the specific figures whose reactions have been loudest and most sustained, is something the coverage of those reactions has been carefully declining to engage with directly. Here is what is actually happening beneath the surface of the visible meltdown. The figures whose public responses have been loudest are not reacting to the policy content of what Bondi moved on. They don't actually disagree at the level of stated institutional position with the prosecutorial priorities the directive establishes. Many of them have publicly defended aggressive use of exactly those priorities in other contexts toward other targets, for reasons they described at the time as essential to the functioning of accountability within democratic institutions. The policy is not their problem. Their problem is the direction. Their problem is that the architecture Bondi has now activated, running in the direction it is now documented to be running, produces potential outcomes for specific people in specific institutional relationships that those figures have personal, professional, and in some cases financial stakes, in that the previous architecture's suspended animation was preventing. Suspended animation has now ended. The direction is now documented. And the question that the loudest public responses are actually trying to manage through the framing of judicial overreach, institutional capture, weaponized prosecution, and every other rhetorical instrument in the contemporary political response toolkit is not whether the move was procedurally improper. It's whether the noise level can get high enough to create the kind of political pressure that causes institutional actors to hesitate before following the documented direction wherever it leads. That is the strategic calculation embedded in the meltdown. And the calculation is, on its own terms, not irrational. Noise has moved institutional actors before. Political pressure has produced hesitation in formal proceedings before. The toolkit being deployed has a history of operational effectiveness that makes it reasonable, from a certain vantage point, to deploy it again. What's different this time is the form of the documented record that Bondi's directive created. It's not just an order. It's an order with a paper trail that describes in institutional language that the professional framework takes seriously. Exactly what the directive is, why it was issued, what legal and operational authority supports it, and what the institutional process looks like going forward from the moment it cleared the system. That paper trail doesn't negotiate with the noise. It exists independently of the noise. It runs on its own institutional timeline. And the people who understand how institutional timelines work inside the Justice Department understand that the noise, regardless of its volume and its political resonance, operates in a different register than the register the paper trail operates in. The paper trail is the one that matters for the outcomes that matter. For practitioners with technical authority on what Bondi's move actually means in operational terms, and where the chain reaction leads from here. Not partisan analysis. Not political framing. Institutional assessment from people who have spent serious professional time inside the specific structures the directive now affects. A former senior DOJ official with experience across multiple administrations and familiarity with the prosecutorial resource allocation architecture the directive restructures. What Bondi did on Tuesday is administratively straightforward, but operationally consequential, in ways that the public commentary isn't capturing. The restructuring she executed removes the buffer layer that had been operating between the investigative threads with the most political sensitivity and the institutional resources needed to move them forward. That buffer layer existed for reasons that were articulated in procedurally appropriate terms, but served purposes that had nothing to do with the procedural justifications. Removing it doesn't automatically produce prosecutorial outcomes, but it removes the institutional friction that was preventing momentum. And in complex investigations, momentum is almost everything. Once it starts, the internal professional culture of the institution carries it forward, independent of external political dynamics. A constitutional law scholar with extensive publication on executive power and prosecutorial independence. The framing you're hearing from the people attacking this move that it represents politicization, that it represents institutional weaponization, requires a level of historical amnesia that would be remarkable if it weren't so predictable. The same structural argument those figures are now deploying against Bondi's directive was the structural argument that was explicitly rejected by those same figures when the prosecutorial architecture pointed in the direction they preferred. What's actually being argued isn't a principle. It's a position. The position is that this specific activation of institutional authority is illegitimate because of who it threatens rather than because of how it was executed. That's not a constitutional argument. It's a political argument wearing a constitutional costume. A veteran Republican operative with deep familiarity with the alliance structures currently in Meltdown, who requested that specific affiliations not be identified. The panic you're seeing isn't about Tuesday. It's about what Tuesday confirmed about Bondi's operating posture going forward. The question inside certain orbits of the coalition for the last several months has been whether she was managing the institution to protect the coalition's interests, or managing it to function as an independent institutional actor within the framework the coalition controls. Tuesday answered that question in a way that a lot of people were hoping wasn't the answer. And when the answer arrives in the form of a formal directive, rather than a private communication that can be managed quietly, the only operational response available is the public one, which is what you're watching. And the public response is as much about signaling to other institutional actors don't follow where Bondi is pointing. There are political costs as it is about any actual belief that the move can be reversed. A former federal prosecutor with experience in complex institutional investigations who requested limiting details. The section of Tuesday's directive that the public response isn't engaging with is the section that describes the timeline. There's language in the operational framework she transmitted that establishes internal review checkpoints that create institutional accountability for the resources she's redirected in ways that make subsequent reversal by a later institutional actor significantly more procedurally complex. She didn't just point the resources. She built a structure around the pointing that makes unpointing them require a documented institutional decision rather than an informal management choice. That's the design feature nobody is discussing publicly. And it's the feature that tells you this wasn't improvised Tuesday afternoon. This was architected over a period of time by someone who understood exactly what she was building and exactly what the building would survive. Here is precisely where the chain reaction stands now and what the next phase produces if the trajectory holds. The loudest voices in the current meltdown have approximately 60 days of viable noise before the institutional timeline they're trying to disrupt with that noise reaches a procedural stage that noise cannot affect. 60 days is not a long window. It feels longer than it is. It feels longer because the coverage cycle that processes political drama operates on a rhythm that can make 60 days of sustained narrative feel like an indefinite condition rather than a countdown. It is a countdown. And the people who are counting know they are counting. The strategic options available to the coalition figures most exposed by the chain reaction are narrower than the public posture of those figures suggests. The first option, congressional intervention, they attempt to use oversight authority and appropriations leverage to create the institutional friction that Bondi's architecture removed, requires a level of coalition discipline that the current composition of the relevant congressional majorities does not reliably produce on matters, where the political exposure is as obvious as this one. The second option, direct appeal to the principle, the attempt to use the relationship architecture between the coalition and the administration's ultimate political authority to transmit pressure, that reaches Bondi through channels she cannot formally document and, therefore, cannot formally resist, has already been attempted in forms. That, the people attempting it, would deny making if asked publicly and has produced, thus far, no documented reversal in the operational direction the directive established. The third option, legal challenge to the directive's procedural validity, an attempt to construct a formal legal theory that the restructuring exceeded the institutional authority of the Attorney General's office in ways that a court would find justiciable, is being explored in the conversations that don't appear on public calendars. And the legal practitioners whose counsel is being sought in those conversations are working with a directive that was designed from the beginning to be as legally bulletproof as the professional sophistication of the people who built it could make it. It was built by people who are very good at their jobs. And it was built to survive exactly the challenges that the people now in Meltdown are preparing to bring against it. None of that changes based on the decibel level of the public response. None of it changes based on the narrative architecture that has been constructed to explain the meltdown in terms that don't require the people closest to the exposure to acknowledge what the exposure actually is. The directive exists. The paper trail exists. The timeline is running. And the institutional culture of the specific structures that Bondi has now activated with documented resources and protected with procedural architecture is a culture that, in the professionals who carry it forward, is substantially more durable than the political noise operating around it. The final thing that needs to be said about Tuesday's directive and what comes after it is the thing that the coverage has been most carefully avoiding, because it requires a level of directness about the underlying reality that the conventions of political journalism are structurally ill-equipped to produce. What Bondi did on Tuesday was not complicated. It was not subtle. It was not the kind of institutional move that requires sophisticated legal analysis to understand at its most basic operational level. She took authority that the Attorney General's office holds, applied it in a direction that the available institutional record supports applying it, protected that application with procedural architecture that makes reversal difficult, and transmitted it to the relevant institutional actors in a form that established a documented baseline from which the investigation infrastructure now operates. That's it. That's the move. It is bureaucratically unremarkable in its mechanism and potentially historic in its consequence. And the reason the meltdown has been as loud and as sustained and as structurally revealing as it has been is not because the move was illegitimate. It's because it was legitimate. Completely, documentably, institutionally, legitimately executed. And legitimacy, when it operates in the direction of accountability rather than away from it, is the thing that the people most exposed by accountability have the fewest tools to resist. They're using all the tools they have. You're watching them use every one. The chain reaction Bondi started on a Tuesday afternoon with a directive that arrived in the right inboxes before the people who needed to stop it knew it was coming. That reaction is not in its final stage. The procedural timeline has weeks left before it reaches the stage where the noise becomes irrelevant, not because it stopped, but because the institutional process has moved past the point where noise can reach it. Between now and then, every instrument in the political response toolkit will be fully deployed. The volume will increase before it decreases. The framing will become more aggressive before it becomes less. The claims about institutional illegitimacy, about politicized prosecution, about weaponized governance, those claims, will grow more elaborate and more desperate in direct proportion to the distance the institutional timeline puts between itself and the window in which they could have actually worked. Watch the claims. Watch the volume. Watch the escalation pattern. And then watch the docket. Because the chain reaction runs on institutional logic, not political logic. And institutional logic doesn't care about the noise level. It cares about the documented record, the procedural architecture, and the professional culture of the people who carry it forward when the political world is screaming at them to stop. Those people are not stopping. The directive is in the system. The timeline is running. The meltdown tells you exactly how much is at stake for the people melting down. That's all it tells you. Stay in this, subscribe, notifications on. Because the next procedural threshold, the one that arrives in the institutional calendar before the 60-day window that the current noise campaign was built to fill, is the document that determines whether Tuesday was the beginning of the chain reaction or the moment the chain reaction became something else entirely. The directive is in the system. The clock is running. I'll be here when the next stage clears.